So, I would like to talk about Panchsheel-Multilateralism and competing regionalism. I think I have the distinction today of having chosen the longest title in the booklet that you have. It is actually based upon a book I have written with a much shorter title, simply titled India's Foreign Policy and Regional Multilateralism. So, I am going to follow the following 5 points. The presentation, yeah, you can see it there. I would like to do a bit of a brief introduction and also locate the topic in the wider realm of international relations. Then I have just 1 or 2 slides on what I think are the major norms and determinants of India's foreign policy and security. Then I will do 4 case studies. But you can imagine time constraints will not really allow me to go into much detail. So what I will do is a meta-analysis. I will just present some which I find major basic facts and figures, and then I come to the conclusions about this term, this concept of mine, which I call Panchsheel-Multilateralism and competing regionalism. Let me just come back for 1 second to the key questions of session 1, and I have highlighted this in red. So what we want to look at, what we want to analyze is if India possesses a systemic set of ideas, practical and theoretical, articulating its national interests. We look at national identity, power, sovereignty, norm building, and multilateralism. In essence, this is exactly what I did in my book. I posited that India does indeed have a set of ideas that have influenced its dealings with regional multilateralism, with regional cooperation. And going 1 step further, in the booklet also, there are 4 key questions. You have them in front of you. And I would like to add actually 1 or 2 more questions. The 4th one here is, why is there no NATO in South Asia? Or you might also ask, why is there no security community in South Asia, in the Indian Ocean, in the Bay of Bengal? And also, why is it that institutionalism, that regional institutions in South Asia have, in my view, and I think this is also the majority's view, failed to take off completely? So the focus of the book and the paper is the Indian approach towards regional multilateralism from 1947 until 2015. So that is a very long time span, and of course I cannot do justice in 15 minutes to it. Important to see here is I have defined in my book, not so much in the paper that you have in front of you, what is regional multilateralism. And for the purposes of this conference, I want to keep it at a very basic level. I just want to say we are looking at general multilateral cooperative activities in regard to a specific region, that is South Asia, the Bay of Bengal, and the Indian Ocean, in economic, in social, in cultural, and with a big question mark, in military terms. What I'm interested in are the normative determinants of regional multilateralism, and especially the institutional setup of the organizations. So for each organization, I have just 1 overview slide. And most importantly, I'm interested in patterns. As a political scientist, I'm looking for patterns of cooperation, for historic patterns, for special concepts. And this presentation will definitely not be any kind of descriptive account, nor will I make any prescriptions. This is really just a look at the facts. If you will, it's a German perspective on regional multilateralism, and I hope it is not an Eurocentric or German-centric at that. I have to make 2 caveats. The one is, all 4 organizations originated at different points of time under different political, domestic, and international constellations. So let us not compare apples with pears. It doesn't make any sense. We have completely different time frames. We are looking at different socio-economic backgrounds. We are looking at different political leaders who were in charge at the time. But still, I keep up the argument that we can say there are patterns. There were patterns and there are patterns emerging, and that India is always center stage when it comes to regional cooperation. And then caveat 2 also, certainly there are multifactorial explanations. There are a great number of actors. The focus here today can only be on the actual end results, on the institutional setup. I think, especially looking at India's foreign policy, that regional multilateralism has been neglected as a focus of its foreign policy. When you look at this matrix, in the center you see, of course, the nation state, and then the nation state is surrounded, it is majorly influenced by different segments. One of this being regional integration spheres. Most well known, of course, the European Union, the NAFTA. you will hardly find that anybody says that SARC is an organization that has influenced Indian behavior. It's just the other way around. And what I also find important, that the term, the idea, the concept, if you will, of regional multilateralism has been declared the next paradigm in global affairs. On CNN, there are also op-eds, it's not only television, and on January 14th of 2012, there was a much cited article that just said everything related to regional multilateralism has to be observed, has to be analyzed, because it is going to be one of the next major things in international relations. That is one thing. The other thing, you all know that the European Union received the Nobel Prize for Peace in 2012. I wonder, will SARC ever receive the Nobel Prize for its role in the peace process, for example, between India and Pakistan? Is that possible? We'll see about that later. And of course, Obama and Clinton talked about America's Pacific century and the Asia pivot. And I'm also asking, are they actually talking to regional organizations when they say we shift our focus away from old Europe towards new Asia, the Asian century? Will they have organizations in mind? Or will they just look at or talk to China and India, just the big players, if you will? So when we take a look at this map, what we can see is we are living in a world of regions, a world of regional organizations, especially a world of regional economic activities. Most notably the European Union, that also has the political aspect. And then we have NAFTA, we have the Mercosur. I'm quite happy actually to see that on this map there is also SARC. There is no mentioning of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, there is no mentioning of the BIMSTEC, even though looking at the theoretical economic significance of the potential that lies within the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal. I mean, these organizations, I'll come to that in a minute, they offer everything for everybody. But you won't find them on these maps because as actors in international relations, they play absolutely no role. And that leads me already to the last slide of my introduction, namely the puzzle. In my book, of course, I'm using many more citations, so these are practically taken out of context, but they do underscore my actual point. Referring to the SARC in 2005, former Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh said, "The honest answer is that, after 20 years, regional economic cooperation in South Asia has fallen far short of our expectations." In a way, this was seconded by the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Myanmar, Mr. Nguyen Win, who said, "There has been a general perception that despite 7 years of efforts by the MGC countries to move forward in areas designated for cooperation, there has been very slow progress." And the former Indian Minister of External Affairs, Tharoor, he said, "After 12 years of cooperation, the Indian Ocean Rim Association has not done enough to get beyond declaratory phases that marks most new initiatives." So what we have on a very simple level is the failure of regional cooperation to take off. Everybody at the highest level says, there's nothing is happening. We are meeting, we are discussing, we are agreeing on certain areas of cooperation, but the end result after 7 years, after 14 years, after 20 years is practically nothing. There's no result. So who's to blame is not the question that I want to ask. Because this is not about blame, this is really about a much wider perspective. This is about who are the actors, what are their ideas, what are their norms. And since we are talking about the Indian approach, in my book and a bit in my article also, I claim that one can analyze India's foreign policy with a matrix that I have devised here. And let's just say this matrix, consisting of these 9 points that you see in front of you, it rests on idealist and realist pillars. If you want, you can call them Nehruvian pillars plus realist pillars. You can also go back in time. You can look at Ashoka, if you will. You can look at Buddha. Of course, you can look at Gandhi. This is what I've done in my book, so I can really just throw this slide at you. And you have tolerance, you have non-violence, you have a mandala strategy, of course that is Kautilya and Chanakya. Most importantly for me and for this conference here are the Panchshila or the Panchsheel principles, that is number 4, and number 5, which is non-alignment, and then number 9, the principle of bilateralism. And when you take these 3, when you accept that India's foreign policy has these principles, these norms, these determinants underlying its core philosophy, then I think one can begin to understand why regional cooperation is an undertaking that is unlikely to succeed any time in the future, unless you heed what the Indian Prime Minister said last Saturday, and that is my final slide, what he said, what he called for. So these are the norms and determinants that I identify that make up India's foreign policy, sort of as a matrix of analysis. And if you want to go into more detail, that is number 4 here, the Panchsheel principles, and I'm sure all of you know, these are made up of these 5 points, of course, the 5 principles. Most importantly, non-interference in each other's internal affairs. Nehru once famously said, Panchsheel means every country fending for itself. And that idea, I am an actor, I am a sovereign actor, I just do my own business, I do not interfere with another country's business, is very, very important for multilateralism. Which is not to say that multilateralism means interfering. But if you talk about the question, why is there no NATO? Why is there no collective security? Why is there no security community? These points, even though we are talking about regional economic activity in the 4 organizations I will present now, these 4 points are also very important. Because NATO, as you all know, means an attack on one country is an attack on all countries. Collective security. It means you can theoretically interfere on the territory of another country. And that is completely anathema to these principles and norms of India's foreign policy. And as the last slide for my second point, these are the 2 citations which I have in my paper, so they're in front of you. And especially number 2 is just referring to what I said. Nehru talked about a defense alliance, and he just asks, that's the last sentence here in red, does this not affect the whole conception of integrity, of sovereignty, and independence of the country of this area, once you enter into a NATO-like alliance? So this seems to be running completely against everything that Indian foreign policy stands for. Once again, my analysis is a normative analysis. It looks at the norms of India's foreign policy. So then, moving on to my 4 case studies, that is very briefly. In my book, I look at the development of regionalism. Let's say we start in 1947 or 1949 with the New Delhi Conference on Indonesia. And when you move along in time, from 1949 until September 61, until the NAM summit in Belgrade, you had all these visions. You had the first attempts. We should cooperate. We must have some sort of Asian organization. We must have a better working together. We must network more. These were the ideas that were forwarded all the time. What came out of it? Between 1949 and 1961, except for grand rhetoric, it's nothing concrete, nothing whatsoever. And in 1961 then, the whole thing petered out. And as I've written in red, between 1961 and 1978, there was actually no more regional multilateral activity whatsoever in South Asia with India's participation, if you will. And then it took until 1978 until the first next major step was taken. That was the year when the first discussions were led about a genuine South Asian regional organization. And on the slide here, you can see, of course, these are the countries, Afghanistan joined later, that now make up SARC. SARC, on the face of it, is a very impressive organization. It is the largest organization population-wise in the world, which, of course, including India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, means it harbors about 1.6 billion people. The economic possibility of this organization, it's limitless. However, SARC has never taken off. Thousands of books, thousands of articles have been written ever since 1978, ever since the first discussions took place on the organization. And just to give you sort of a fact sheet here, and this is important for the kind of patterns I've been looking for. The original initiative came from Bangladesh, so a smaller neighbor of India, of course, in 1978. The original vision was, we want to have an extensive regional multilateral organization, even along the lines of the European communities. So there were talks about economic cooperation. There were also ideas of security, but that was shed quite in the beginning. There were 7 years of negotiations, and then the organization was founded in 1985. And very important to see that in 1985, with the SARC Charter, the Panchsheel principles were incorporated. When you look at the charter, they're there in the foreword, in the opening paragraphs. So the Panchsheel are the guiding principles for this organization. SARC has 8 members. It has a headquarters, which I think is a very important thing to mention, because it means there is some degree, some very low degree of institutionalization. It has a Secretary General, observer countries, and when you try to analyze the organization, because not so much has happened, you can analyze it following the summits, because the summits are the public display of the country, of the institution. So you have had 18 summits until 2015, and the organization follows what I call diminished multilateralism or minimal multilateralism. It only has a very loose institutional structure. It has summits, it has Council of Ministers, and it has standing committees. So besides a secretariat in Kathmandu, not much really can be said. Okay, we have SARC conventions and agreements, very few of them. And I have to speed up a bit because I've been taking too much time already. To end this brief overview of SARC, you're looking at the achievements. So you have a headquarters and you have a Secretary General. When you talk about ASEAN, you talk about an ASEAN way. You talk about ASEAN identity. You would never talk about a SARC identity. You would never talk about a SARC way of dealing with things. So summarizing, you have non-institutionalization, you have diminished multilateralism. Here in New Delhi, you have the South Asian University as one important educational outflow of SARC. You have very little economic relevance despite SAFTA, which is in place since 2006 but not fully operational. And the political relevance is mostly said to have been the summit meetings, so that Indian and Pakistani leaders have been able to meet and do behind the scenes talks. So that is one organization, one example for regional multilateralism. And moving on, you have a different attempt of regional multilateralism in the Indian Ocean. Looking at the history, just comparable to Asian conferences, between 1971 and 1997, there were several attempts of having some sort of institutional framework. All of these failed. What came about in 1997 was the Indian Ocean Rim Association for Regional Cooperation. The name was now changed to Indian Ocean Rim Association. And just as SARC is the largest organization in terms of population, the IORA is the largest organization in terms of space. There is no organization that covers a greater array, a greater geographic expanse than the IORA. Now, talking about patterns, again, negotiation stages, about 3 years. Initiative from smaller countries, especially Australia, South Africa. Original vision, extensive regional multilateralism, and especially a focus on security and politics. That was the Australian wish. What we have today, 20 countries, 6 dialogue partners. You have certain sectors of cooperation. You do have a very small secretariat, just like 6 people working there. But you only had 13 meetings until 2015. There has never been a summit meeting, only Council of Ministers meetings. And when you look at the institutional structure, it's very loose. Council of Ministers meetings, and then you have a so-called tripartite structure, which means members from the economic side, members from the academia, and members from the civil society side. They meet irregularly. And Shashi Tharoor summed it up famously or infamously: the organization is lean to the point of emaciation, with just a half a dozen staff, including the gardener, after 17 years. Okay, next, the BIMSTEC, the Bay of Bengal initiative. Quite fascinating to see. It is SARC minus Pakistan plus Thailand. It is the exact kind of organization, the exact kind of idea. Patterns. Negotiation stages, 3 years, 4 years. Initiator was Thailand. Original vision, economics, of course, but also political cooperation. Founded in 1997, it took an incredible 17 years before a secretariat was just now established in Dhaka, just a few months ago. So for 17 years, there was no institutional mechanism, nothing that would actually allow you to address somebody, no Secretary General. You only had 3 summits, and you have, in the planning stages, an FTA, but nothing has come out of it yet. And again, for me, this is a sign of non-institutionalization. When you look at the organization in terms of how it is organized, it's extremely loose. You only have foreign ministers meeting, and now, as I said, a secretariat. since I'm using two terms for my presentation, one is Panchsheel-Multilateralism, which is my view is what could be called India's approach towards multilateralism. The second term that I'm using is competing regionalism, because India is a member of 4 regional organizations, and in theory it could use the leverage, it could use one organization to play it off against the other. So for example, if BIMSTEC took off, if BIMSTEC ever worked, India could in a way withdraw from SARC because it has every country except for Pakistan as a member in this organization. Okay, and very briefly now, you have the Mekong-Ganga cooperation. So this is this group of country along the rivers of the Mekong and Ganga. An initiative by Thailand, founded in 2000. You have only 6 members. The idea was fantastic. You meet along the sidelines of the ASEAN. Unfortunately, only 6 meetings have taken place, and this organization is practically moribund. So I have 1 minute left, which means I jump to my conclusions. I have just shown you 4 maps, and if I combine these maps and I use a Venn diagram, you can see you have 4 regional organizations which overlap in geography, which overlap in size, which overlap in membership, which overlap in sectors of activity. None of these organizations has really taken off. And my concluding slide would be this one then, an analysis of regional multilateralism. It is my analysis. There were always recurring patterns in the initial negotiations. The original initiator had a grand vision, was eventually sidelined, and the grand visions were scaled back to minimal multilateralism. All of these 4 organizations, if you can even use the term organization, are under-institutionalized, under-financed, and understaffed. In my perspective, Panchsheel-Multilateralism is one important normative determinant. Competing regionalism would be one possible strategy for India. The paradigm of bilateralism is one major foreign policy principle of India, which also means India has bilateral agreements with every country in the region, and therefore it weakens its own regional multilateral framework. And India has been very supportive, there's no question about it, about the low politics dimension of regional multilateralism. And for me, it's interesting to see that just on Saturday, and with that I conclude, Prime Minister Modi asked the Indian diplomatic corps to shed old mindsets. And I think that the Panchsheel and the whole norms and determinants which I just enumerated are a clear sign of old, not necessarily wrong, but old mindsets. So maybe this call for action is also a call for, in a way, recalibrating regional cooperation and regional multilateralism. Thank you very much.